Hello and welcome back to the Comic Books Matter podcast. I'm your host, Jesse, and with me today is a very special guest. She has written for Uppercut, Waypoint, SideQuest. She's the co-host of the podcast Idle Talk, and she knows more about Final Fantasy than I ever will. It's Grace Benfell. How are you doing, Grace?
Hello. My Final Fantasy expertise is still forming, but I appreciate that.
I've read pretty much every Final Fantasy article, at least the two Final Fantasy articles I know of that you've posted.
Well, seven's the only. Well, and seven itself is the only one that I really deep into. I'm trying to make my way through the whole series right now, which has been fun, but is going slower than I like because I keep starting projects like that.
Even though they technically have only up to number 15, that's 20 games?
Yeah, well, so I'll be playing. I'm not gonna bother with spin-off stuff unless I really want to. I'm not gonna play the sequel to 12 that's on DS. But I'm gonna play 10-2 and
what about the MMOs? Because technically those are.
Oh yeah, I'm skipping the MMOs. Maybe some brave day I will get into Final Fantasy 14. I do not think that day is soon.
Yeah, I feel it. I still am struggling with just normal games in general.
Yeah, I started to play the Old Republic right around when the pandemic started, and played a good 10 hours or so, and then just completely dropped it. So
yeah, one of my good friends, Steven, who did the logo for the show and stuff, he was playing a ton of Old Republic, and then he signed up for a coding class to try to get some more job skills, and he's like, well, I could keep playing Old Republic, or I could do good in my class.
Yeah, the time commitment is just so heavy on stuff like that it's very, especially hearing Austin on Waypoint describe his journey of playing 150 hours to get to stuff that he thought was good, was I'm all right. I can play 6 Final Fantasy games in that time.
Yeah, I don't need to put in the effort.
Yeah.
I feel the same way about a lot of things. How much effort do I have to put in for it to quote unquote get good?
Yeah.
I was talking about that. I've been binging a lot of webtoons because I'm just on my phone a lot more lately.
Yeah.
And I want to keep reading, so I'm reading webtoons because they're free and they're on the phone. And I'm reading Tower of God, and it's 400 something chapters, and I hit a point where it just got real slow, and I'm like, oh man. I liked where it came from, so I'm just gonna push through. And now it's gotten really fast paced. But I have a friend who stopped at the same point I did, and I'm like, can I convince him that 40 chapters of slowness is worth all the cool stuff I'm reading right now?
Yeah, it's a tough. I mean, I always like a little slowness. Although I also am one of these folks who complains about games being too long, generally speaking. So
yeah, I guess there's a difference between slowness that's empty and slowness that gives you time to think.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I think Blade Runner 2049 is one of my favorite movies in a lot of ways. And that movie's very, very slow.
It is, I was happy to see how... It's been a while since I've seen it, but I quite liked it at the time, and it's...
Yeah.
It's a sequel to Blade Runner, a movie that is also slow, which is great.
Yeah, and it gives you a lot to digest, more than I think the first one did, so that's why I think that slowness works so well for that movie.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody was prepared for it.
Yeah, it was seeing an ad describe it as action packed, when it was out on Blu-ray, was very strange to me. It's there's 3 minutes of action sequences in this movie.
I mean, they're cool, they're very brutal and fun, but also
for sure. Yeah.
So Grace, you suggested today that you want to talk about Zot by Scott McCloud.
Yeah.
And we were talking right before this that both of us kind of only knew Scott through his books about writing or art in comic books, not really about his works itself.
Yeah, so I actually I sort of briefly after I got into comic books in late elementary school, my neighbor who's a film professor told me about understanding comics, and so that was one of the first graphic novels I read. And it's wild because I think about a lot of stuff I like to read now is kind of this meaty lit crit theory. And that I think that was my entry point into a lot of that.
Yeah, the great thing about that book is it is a comic book in itself, which is really nice, but at the same time it's super critical about the craft. in a way that you don't get through comics very often.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, the fact that like he the anyway, I don't want to get like too far in the weeds understanding comics. It's been a while since I've read it, but the way he talks about art in that as like basically anything that has to do that's outside of survival or instinct, sort of like blowing a raspberry is art, and like the way you tap on your desk while you're working is art, right? That's sort of like opening, and democratization is not the right word, but sort of that, like, there's a very radical sense of like openness to that that I think was very eye-opening to me at the time, and like helped me sort of ground and contextualize like a lot of my, or at least justify a lot of my interests in stuff like comics and video games, which especially comics at the time had not, I feel like, reached the level of cultural legitimacy or like cultural widespreadness that they have today. At least that was my feeling in middle school.
With his the way it's critically written too, like there's I do enjoy reading critical pieces about any subject, and I've read critical pieces about comics too, but having a critical piece about comics that's within a comic, that's not sort of like trying to subvert the genre or try to be tongue-in-cheek about it, but actually just like, here's my thoughts and let me illustrate the thoughts too.
Yeah,
though I think that's the best, like that's one of the best ways to get comic criticism. And I know it's like not everybody can do it. Scott McCloud literally can draw super duper well, so like he has all the talent to do that. But man, if I could just get more of that kind of criticism in that form, that would be so nice. Because a lot of times with video games, you can want either add screenshots pretty easily in a lot of ways, and you can do that too with comics. But I feel like you can visualize the video games and movies much easier than you can panels, and exactly what you're talking about within panels.
Well, I mean, that's something that he talks about, is the idea of meaning being created in the juxtaposition of the panels, right? The the gutter. There's a whole chapter about this, right? The space in between the two panels creates connective tissue that you then like string into meaning. And I mean, it's very similar to like montage in film, right? Where it's like, oh, you see two separate images, but because they're cut right after each other, oh, this is connected, right? This is meaning is connected. But I think, there is a sense of flow that you kind of lose in translation. And that isn't to say like, I think one can write well about just about anything, and there's always that loss of translation. That's part of the work of criticism, is trying to bring out like, hey, what was this experience through something that is totally different than that experience. That's one of the things I think is really fulfilling about it. But yeah, like I think understanding comics is great in the way that it sort of tries to embody and work through the stuff that it's doing very literally, right? That like Scott McCloud is experimenting with the space between panels as he is talking about what the space between panels does, right? And that's I think very, it's like watching like an experimental film, right? It's like reading about film theory can be really satisfying, right? And reading about experimental film can be really satisfying, but there's something uniquely satisfying in seeing something that's actively playing with the medium. And I mean, this is something that I'm getting way off track here, talking about theory.
It's totally fine. This is what you're here for.
This is my shit. But the with theory class I took it in college, one thing we did is we read a short story, and then we read a piece of critical theory, right? And then did papers where it's kind of hard to describe, but we'd talk about the story using the lens of the critical theory, and then we talk about the theory using the lens of the story, right? And so this way of like blurring the line between like something that's fiction or like a work in of itself and stuff that's commenting on that work, right? I think that's something that's also really helped inform a criticism. And I think that's something that, it's weird. It feels like this like stepping stone towards my like future education and stuff, because understanding comics kind of embodies that in a big way.
Yeah, and with the idea that you watch something, you read something, get the theory, and then understand the theory, and then apply it back into the book, I think in a lot of ways too helps push the idea, and the idea that I think a lot of people should really think about when they go back to things that they love or cherish after they've grown and expanded. That even if something teaches you a theory, it teaches you an idea of what something could tell you, if you just reapply it, you'll get something else out of it again with that same exact theory or lens. I feel like, like I can try to think of a book off the top of my head, but like Great Gatsby. I read Great Gatsby for the first time last year, because my school was bad about telling me to read books. And I read it 3 times in a row, like back to back to back. It's a very short book, so that was kind of easy to do.
Yeah.
But every time I reread it, and I kept in my, after I read it the first time, I had my idea what the book was, and I kept that idea every single time afterwards. But yet I got different examinations of each character each time through that lens of what I thought the book was.
Yeah. Well, I think that's something that's actually, if we can kind of use this as a transition to Zot. So the collection I read, this is probably the one that you read too, has a bunch, like after each sort of arc, there's like an essay from Scott talking about like that issue and like stuff that's going on in his life. And so there is a sense of this kind of being like this document that's trying to comment on itself and rework itself, right? Which is, I mean, very much, I think, a Scott McCloud thing to do. Not just to like reprint something, but also to give all this context and try and like explore it formally in a really direct way.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because the way I read it was I just didn't have time to pick up a copy at all.
Yeah.
And now that I've read a few of the issues, I'm probably gonna find the collection whenever I can. So I was reading scans just because, and that's a bad thing. Don't do that. Don't read scans if you can avoid it.
Hey, I had
5 days.
No, you're good. You're good. And also, generally speaking, I'm pro. I mean, it depends. Obviously, power dynamics are a thing, but stealing from corporations, it's good.
Yeah, no, that's true. That is true. Stealing from people who are bad, but you like the characters that they worked on, that's also good. Because like this is another tangent, but like there's a whole thing about the Red Hood writer Scott McCloud and all that stuff. I've never bought one of his books brand new. I always bought them secondhand because I don't want to give him money.
Yeah, no, I think that's not like I think examining material conditions is like a really important thing to do.
But what's fascinating is like knowing that there's essays gets me even more intrigued to get that collection. But at the same time, reading the scans, it has like the ads and not really the ads, but like the way it was cut as an actual comic book, as a published comic.
Did you?
Yeah.
You didn't get to the normal essay, right? So there's sort of a split, and it's very formally put in the collection where Zot gets trapped on Earth.
Yeah,
we should, I guess, set up what this comic book is.
Yeah, we can go briefly into what it is in a second, but there's a good split, especially with the scans I was reading, because it was originally color, and then it went to black and white, and so
this is also
that great
the collection. Sorry, I didn't even talk over you, but the collection I have is not any of the color issues; it's just the black and white ones.
Oh, cool! So we can definitely bounce back and forth between the essays and what I saw with the art.
Yeah.
So do you want to describe what the comic is, or do you want me to?
I can do it, and then maybe you can fill in, because I feel like there's some the black and white stuff is mostly separate from the color stuff, but it does refer back to it occasionally. So there might be some context that I don't have because I've never read those. But basically, it's a story about Zot. It's a superhero in sort of this paradise version of Earth. I mean, it's very like 50s DC comics, right? Like Earth 2, and Zot's there, and like it's this, it's 1965 there. Everything's really beautiful and great, and things are like idyllic for the most part. And then Jenny, who comes from our world, right, and is very like disillusioned. They're both teenagers. They're both like 15, and the stories are kind of about like it's metafictional in some way because it's sort of about someone's interaction with like what is metaphorically a superhero comic, right? Yeah, and then also kind of like what is idealism? How does that function in the world? How do we like work through that? And basically like this issue structure, at least in the stuff that I read, is like basically there's like an arc per villain. And you sort of get what was the stuff you read for you got up to issue 17. Yeah, so it was like I want to say it was issues 1 through 10 were the colored ones. Yes, that's correct. And so reading issues 1 through 10 and then switching to the color ones. And I'm probably going to go compare this to other more independent works that I've read too, because it feels very much like that 80s to 90s just underground comic scene, the way the switch happens in a lot of ways. But that first 10 issues feels very much like a golden age book where the hero is kind of naive, doesn't really know what's kind of like, what's the word? Like there's no gray area. There's just right and there's wrong. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And when Jenny falls into the world after him, in the first issue,
she's very much like, wow, this is idealist. This is like the best thing that I could ever be a part of. Because she was very like, you get a very good perspective that she's very bored in the world she's in.
Yeah.
And she kind of hates everything about it. So
Yeah,
when she
her
goes,
family's sorry.
oh yeah,
Having
no, her
trouble
family's jerk. Yeah.
yeah.
Her brother's kind of racist and also sexist and really just all around not great to hang around.
Yeah.
Yeah, so her getting trapped in there with Zot and her brother being trapped in there with her at times, but that's a whole other thing. It really becomes, in those first 10 issues, just kind of a golden age book, being very tongue-in-cheek with how those books were written, but without really saying much until the last few issues, I feel like.
Yeah.
Because the whole premise of those first 10 issues is there's a key that everybody's after. And that key opens up a door to the quote-unquote edge of the universe. And the whole first, like, 7 or 8 issues is all about finding that key. And they find it in the first issue, and then they lose it, and it's just back and forth. And there's all these B plots that are, I think, more complex than the A plots. Right. But they never really give you the spotlight on those to like breathe on them for very long. It's all about Zot just moving forward and all this pulp action through every single issue.
Well, so he talks about writing and drawing those, and that he was like, I was kind of making this up as I went along, and like trying to prove to myself that I could like do this kind of book.
Which at times it felt like, oh, I think he wrote himself into a corner. He didn't know how to get out of here.
Yeah, well, there's stuff like that to be. I mean, there's some Deus Ex Machina kind of stuff in the newer issues too. But I do think that there is like a shift in sort of tone and maturity. Especially, you read the Decker issues, right? You would have gotten there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are some of my favorite issues, I think, in the collection. And I think it sort of speaks to what you're talking about. You have these villains that have some sort of interesting stuff going on, right? That don't get. So we left off with the Decker.
Yeah, the Decker stuff.
Yeah, so just that, like, these characters, the villains, get more time to breathe and like be characters and sort of have you understand them and their motivations, right? This is something that I'm inferring based on like both what I've read about these 10 issues and how you're talking about them.
Yeah. The most fascinating thing between the transition from the color pages and the black and white pages is that tonal shift that you're talking about, where it's very like Zot's just like, I am the hero. And in the last, I want to say 1 to 2 issues, it might have been just the last one because they all kind of blend together when you binge them.
Yeah.
For issue 10 at least, when they go through the door, which the door itself is kind of funny, but when they go through the door and he kind of gets kind of essays talk to him about like what it means to be like in a reality and such.
Yeah.
And then he comes back. It becomes very tonally different, even in the last issue in color, where he beats the villain, he beats the big bad guy, and everybody sees on TV that the big bad guy was manipulating them to the TV, and they're like, oh, that's earlier now. And he's like, guys, think for yourselves. Don't just listen to what people are telling you. I'm not your savior. And he's like, you know what? I give up. And he turns off the programming. And that's how that issue ends. Where it seems like he's very defeated. And then when they switch to the black and white issues, he comes back into the universe after being gone for like a few months. And he comes back into our Earth and is very idealistic again, and then gets hit with a huge slap of reality. Yeah.
Well, I think that that first issue is like showing, I think, some of the weirder tensions that I think are in this that McCloud, because there's a real sense of like, oh, you go to New York City, crime there's bad people there, that I think is kind of stooped in some like racial stuff.
Yeah.
That doesn't super work, but there's also like a real sort of interesting thematic thing, right? That you have someone from a different world that is better, right? And that knows in kind of a material way that different world is possible, right? That there is something else that can be achieved, but that is also constantly sort of confronted with the realities of how our world does not match up to that, right? And I think that's a really sort of rich tension that the series isn't always the best at exploring, but sometimes really hits. That's sometimes when it's at its most effective.
Yeah, when I got to the black and white issues, it really, really hit me with this sense of oh crap, who is the writer of this book now? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Terry Moore's Stranger in Paradise, because I was been binging that.
Oh yeah,
a while back, and It's another one of those independent black and white books for the most part. And at times, I don't think it lands everything it's trying to say, but it's willing to risk its characters, well, not even its characters, its tones, to really talk about things that matter in society more so. It's not willing to stray away from really, really, really dark places. And I feel like once Zot hit that black and white issue, that first one at least for sure, you could feel the tonal shift of being like, we're not playing the safe golden age game anymore.
Yeah.
He's gonna get hit with doses of reality that are gonna be really hard for you as a reader and him as a character to swallow.
Yeah. Well, I think also that and McCloud talks about this moment. So there's a scene at the end of I think at that arc is just like 2 issues.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the second issue, Zot's like going to leave, right? I mean, just, not like forever, but just like going back
break,
home, right? But he's been like beat up and having a bad time. And Jenny's like, why do you care about this world? Why do you even want to be here? It's like, there's nothing for you here. And he says, yeah, there is. And then kisses her. And that's sort of the final page is like him leaning in to kiss her. And it's just really, I think, even now, like formally striking moment a lot with lighting. There's sort of this, like Zot's face is obscured by sort of the light, like shining behind him. Right. And there's this, I don't know exactly how to describe why it works so well for me, but it's this very poetic moment. I think it shows, like McCloud's not the greatest craftsman, I would say, in these issues, but he's so formally inventive and sort of stretches himself in a lot of ways, and that is really, really fun, especially since like each arc feels really different and it stretches. And I mean, we already talked about understanding comics playing into this, right? But
yeah, I feel like when he hits those issues, the story's not like how it presents itself, but how it lands its points.
Yeah.
As you said, like when he gets beat up and he fights those quote unquote bad guys in the streets, they're not drawn in the most like respected ways. Like they're very stereotypical, a little racist with some of them, like, and so it suffers there, like Sunset or the Night Sky or something. And the way Scott just draws that whole entire scene, his art though gets a chance without the colors, him getting full control of the book. His art gets the chance to really come alive, and without the colors, the art has to do double the work because now it's trying to paint you the colors with just
I'm looking forward to you getting to. So earlier I was talking about because there's kind of 3 splits, I guess, in Zot, because there's that color to black and white transition, and then there's a arc late in, like, I don't remember, it's like issue 20 something, I think, where Zot gets trapped on Earth, right? And then the next like 6 or 7 issues are all just on Earth, and they're very like grounded, sort of like in some cases autobiographical, but like in narrative stories about people living their lives, basically. And some of the stuff in that is just really, I think, beautiful and striking, like landscape work and stuff, and this interest in the beauty of the mundane that comes across in some of the earlier stuff, but is so striking, especially in contrast to the like very dreamlike, exuberant whimsy of like landscapes in the Zots, in like the science fiction superhero sections of the book.
So to jump out of the book itself for a second and go back to you as a person.
Yes.
How did you find your way into comics?
So I feel like this is a very embarrassing story. So, my parents bought it was like a box set of Spider-Man 1 and 2 special editions.
Okay.
And because I was this kind of kid, I was like watching all the bonus features, because they're like 2-disc DVD sets, right? And there was a couple that were about the comics, and I watched one, and it was I'm trying to remember. So John Romita Jr. and Michael Straczynski talking about the 9/11 issue of Spider-Man.
Oh, that's an issue.
That is an issue. But like that, I don't know. I was a kid, and like that was such a like, whoa, like comic books can be serious. They can be about stuff like this, right?
Yeah.
And so then my parents, like for my birthday, pretty soon after, got me like a 10-issue paperback of Stan Lee's old run on Spider-Man.
Okay.
It's like,
yeah.
It was like issue 22 to 32 or something like that. And I devoured it. And then like there's these like black and white collections of old Marvel comic books called the Essentials.
Yeah,
like,
I know
it's
the
like
Essential Editions. Yeah.
It's really creep. I mean, like it's cheap, right? It's like newspaper print, right? Black and white, but they were so cheap, and so I bought like the entire Stan Lee run of Spider-Man on these, and read all those. And then like I was talking about earlier, I like read Understanding Comics, and so I kind of became like super interested for a while. I wanted to be a comic book artist, and at some point I sort of fell out of it, not like because I didn't like it anymore or anything, but it just sort of, I think video games kind of started to creep in,
Yeah, that makes sense.
As it happens. But McCloud was a big boy because I loved Understanding Comics so much, and so a lot of the stuff I read were recommendations from him. Like I got into Flight and Kazukibushi stuff, like Amulet, and I'm trying to remember, Copper is the other comic he did, web comic he did, through Scott McCloud's recommendations on his website, right? So that was like, yeah, so it's a big, and so Zot is somewhere in there where it's like I'd read about Zot in Understanding Comics, and then I think I bought this pretty soon after it came out, and which is like 2006. It was like the black and white collection, right?
Yeah. Did you get the hardback edition, or did you get the regular one?
No, I have the paperback. It's like torn up now because I've read it dozens of times.
Yeah.
Not recent. Like it's been a few years since I last checked it out, but there was a period where like, especially like those Essentials, I was like reading them, multiple times a year. So yeah, so I don't know. Zot had a big impact on me, I think, partially because it was really cool to see a creator I liked so much doing something else than I was familiar with. Like I'd also read all of, Understanding Comics, Reinventing Comics, and Making Comics. I'd read all that stuff, right? And it was exciting to like see Scott like work with fiction, right? But it's also like, yeah, so you haven't gotten to this yet, because it's post the Earth jump, but there's a kind of, well, it's good actually. I think it's pretty good. There's a story about a lesbian character coming out to herself later. And that was like one of the first examples of queerness I found in like anything I had read, right? Including like I read, I think Runaways was maybe the first. Brian K. Vaughan, Adrian Alphina's Runaways.
That's one of the ones I want to read, but I haven't got around to it yet.
Oh yeah, I want to read it again, but that original run with him and Adrian, with Brian and Adrian, is really, really good. I think that holds up. And I want to read the new Rainbow Rowell stuff too.
I picked that one up because of the show. Okay, and it was cheaper than the full Brian K. Vaughan collection.
Yeah. I have all those hardbacks.
Yeah, but it's very fun still, like even not knowing him much. But I really want to get to that origin and go through it.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I think it holds up. But I'll have to read it again. And that was something that like I I almost don't want to spoil it. There's a very a very fun twist, especially if you go and read the scans with this particular issue. Anyway, it's just like there's a way, I think, especially these later issues, there's a sensitivity to the way Cloud writes these characters, McCloud, I should say, that really struck me. And I think I grew up in a very like, not a conservative household, but a conservative area.
Yeah, I get that.
Sort of culture, and like that was something that I think, not that like changed everything and turned everything around for me, but it was an example of like people talking about things that mattered in a way that was really sensitive. And like still, like I think you read that issue now, especially if you've read like, I'm trying to think of like, but there's lots of comic books that deal with queerness, right? And that are by queer folks. Scott McCloud is a straight guy as far as I'm aware. So it's not particularly complex, but it is, I think, sensitive and like engaging. And I think that just like really hit me as a perspective like that I had not seen before. I didn't have access to, and probably would like this is like one of the weird, interesting things is like I probably wouldn't have let myself read something by someone queer, especially if they were really like out and open about things, right? But seeing like, but getting a comic by someone who is straight, right, and who snuck it in. I didn't know it was going to be there, right? I thought this was a superhero book, But then,
yeah, I mean, there's something
moved
has
up
to be
on me.
said for those early books who even if they were written by straight people or not people of color. Because I always think about Black Panther, Black Panther's introduction to the Marvel Universe, even though it's
Yeah.
by Stanley and Jack Kirby. Um, the idea of them not shying away from taboo areas. Because I remember there was a time too where they questioned even naming Black Panther Black Panther because of
Yeah,
what was
well, I
happening.
think there's even some lampshading of that in the book where like
Yeah,
Black Panther's like, oh, this has political connotations that I don't necessarily, I don't affiliate myself with, but
yeah,
but that
but
tension is still there, right? It's a really rich
yeah,
tension that then Black authors could go on to work with, right?
and I think there's importance for the start of that. At the same time, it's a really interesting subject to talk about because now we have so many creators who make their living off of writing different perspectives where other people of those perspectives aren't making anything.
Right. Yeah. Well,
Some
that's a huge thing. Yeah. When I think
yeah.
that's something that I mean, something that I appreciate about the way McCloud does this. There's also a character, African American character, who's a comic book writer and is sort of a McCloud self-insert, but not really.
Mhm.
That I think does some like I don't know. There's some interesting race stuff in that I don't think is like the best, but also like the thing is this stuff isn't like um the story about Terry, who's this girl who comes out to herself. She's like a character in the first little bit too.
Mhm.
She it's about her realizing that, but it's also like she's a character sort of in the wider history of the story, right? This is
Yeah.
not like a straight author coming in and like, okay, I'm going to write a book about gay people, right? This is like someone realizing something about themselves in the tapestry of this world that already exists, right? And as a character who already exists and has established like motivations and relationships that color her relationship to that stuff, right? And I just think like it's tough, and I think there's all I kind of bristle sometimes when people are like, oh, like straight cis people can't write these kinds of stories because I think there's a reductionist element to that, right? There's a
Yeah.
way in which, um, yeah. Sorry, I'll just finish this thought and then you can.
Yeah. No problem.
There's a way in which that like I think that's, but also like there's a real material element, right? And I think that hopefully and the thing is like in understanding comics and reinventing comics, like Scott McCloud talks about folks like Alison Bechdel, right, who were like doing queer comics when when
Mhm.
McCloud was writing this book, right? It's not so much that I don't feel like he's taking up space that's not welcome for him to take up, at least in my eyes. And he's obviously not a monolith, right?
Yeah.
But
I
yeah, I hope
mean,
that makes sense. That was a little rambly, but
no, I think you hit the nail on the head when it came to the idea of when he wrote the character, he was writing a greater tapestry of the world, less than I'm gonna just make this character to be a guy that made this character, right?
yeah,
And I think that's something to be said with and I always feel bad about critiquing creators that I one day want to talk to, but you just kind of have to do it. Where it's like it kind of becomes partially the modern day Bendis effect, where
oh yeah, for sure.
there's at times where he writes characters to weave a better tapestry. Like I think Miles Morales is a very good character that he's written, that he wrote in the greater scheme of Spider-Man.
Yeah,
But I feel like more of the modern black people that he's written or queer people that he's written feels more like I'm going to make these characters because I need to force representation. Not like representation is forced in general, but I'm just saying like he needs like it's like I need to diversify my portfolio.
yeah.
Which,
Well, I think like I mean, there's stuff like the I mean, I think Monty talked about this on your episode with her.
yeah,
But the like Snowflake and Safe Space characters were like I just think
yeah,
corporate representation has really, really hard limits.
mm-hmm.
And I'm very skeptical of how that stuff like plays out and how it works. And like I've talked about this a lot on Twitter, right, and stuff like that. But and I think the way you sort of avoid a lot of those problems is just try and create something honest and real about how people live in the world, right? And that's the thing is I think there's subtextual stuff you can like. This is one of the things is that this is like a weird thing, and I don't know if I completely have this thought, but like there's Zot is a rich text, right? As we talked a lot about this like utopianism and this relationship with like superhero comics, right? And also this like the way it sort of gets into people's personal lives, it still like reflects like this one about this African American character. He wants to be a comic book writer, and it's basically still about the central tension, whereas like he wants to be this great artist, right? Be this like great writer, and also is like in this world where his dad's really skeptical of him, and like he's, you know, black with all these white friends and doesn't really know how to interact with them, or like there's like stuff, you know, and but also it's like still this reflection of like this tension between this utopian world that we want to live in, right, and the reality of being in the world, and it's just put in this like microcosm that then gets shaded with race stuff and like think other things, right? But it's not exclusively about that, and it's not like him trying to take over a voice that isn't his, right? I feel like
I think it comes down to, does it feel like the writer is checking a box with this plot point?
Yeah.
Because it for sure can come off like that. Again, going back to the Bendis example, because he's the one I have in my mind right now.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think even like we don't have to. This is like a very thorny rabbit hole, but the fact that like, Miles Morales has two father figures in his life, and one is a crook and the other is a cop, is like very suspect to me.
Oh yeah, no,
and
there's plenty of issues with.
Yeah, and reflective, story. I think, of Bendis's limits as like a writer of this kind of stuff. But
when Miles was introduced, because I was reading Ultimate Spider-Man at that time, it felt very much like this is a natural progression of the plot.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But then when I was reading All New X-Men, and all of a sudden Iceman was gay, that felt like I'm checking a box in my run of X-Men that I feel like I need to do. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that has led to some very interesting story developments with like Jesse and Grace's run, and a few other writers who've touched that plot point. But it felt, at the time when reading it, it felt like I have, this is my run, this is the only time I'm going to be touching these characters, I need to check my boxes, changing things up. And that's how that read. Versus Miles felt like this is the progression of Peter's story in this universe.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's also tricky about this is I feel like you know, we don't question the inclusion of white characters in this way. Although maybe we should. Like, I don't know, why is that CIA guy in Black Panther the movie? Does he need to be there?
Yeah, no, I think the further we get along with really having diverse voices and having diverse casts, that question, like why is Martin Freeman in this movie, where you easily could have just replaced him with Samuel L. Jackson if you wanted to, or anybody, like why does it have to be Martin Freeman in this
role? Well, I think I mean, I'm sorry, I'm about to get into like, because I think Black Panther has some stuff ideologically that I have trouble with, and that's one of the things, is that like the CIA agent is like one of the good guys, right?
Yeah, no, for sure.
To, like, you know, so it's but also
that comes down, I feel like, the corporation too. Like,
oh yeah, for sure.
There's a good piece about military criticism in the first Captain America movie, and how it has to be very subtle, but it still does it in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
because of how much the military has invested in movies.
Yeah, like very material stake in the way these movies are made, right?
Yeah. So I feel like it's very interesting, and I think the further we get into criticism of art in general, but diverse criticism, I hope that we do question those choices, especially of inclusion of random white characters in stories that aren't there.
Yeah, but I think that but at the same time, I do think like it's tricky, because I almost don't want to use the word tokenization, because I feel like that's a word that's used by like right-wing assholes who want to be like, oh, they're just putting this in for no reason, right?
Yeah.
But also, like, there is a real way in which like queerness, especially, I mean, this is something that is relevant to me, right, as a trans woman, gets commodified and sold back to people, right? And often that's literally like what representation is doing, is like trying to sell someone's experiences back to you and like framing it as like woke or cool or great, right? And I think the stories that even inside that framework still get away from that are ones where either there's like really rich subtext, right, that talks about some of this stuff. Like I think The Matrix is, you know, Matrix is trans cinema, right? But it's all it's not, you know, very little of it is textual, right? But also like when creators manage to like create something that I think speaks truthfully and feels real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I really agree with you on that. And it becomes a thing where corporations will use as, look at this big issue where we reveal this character's blank, right?
Yeah.
Where it can either come off again super artificial, or if it was already part of the narrative that was coming and they just decided to market it, which, like, for example, the blowback of the Bat and Cat wedding issue 50, right? Everyone's like, they're pushing it. This is the Batman and Catwoman. We're gonna get married. They're gonna get married. Tom King the whole time's like, they're not. What? Please don't. Please don't do this to me. Where I think that can happen too with queerness and people of color and anything like that.
Yeah. And I mean, I just think that like that very idea that it's like in this issue, Iceman gets to be gay, is like there's that feels bad, right? But at the same time, it's like I think also with X-Men, I know there's lots of folks who read X-Men as a queer allegory, right? I mean, the allegory of X-Men as oppressed peoples is really messy in general, but like there's definitely stuff there, right? There's like subtext to read into that, and so I like. But it's so it's it gets tricky, I think, especially when you're talking about stuff of the scales and especially stuff by like straight writers. We've gotten really off the track of Zot, but I think
well, I think it all ties in together, honestly.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
that's why I think that's so great about this. But in the same way, like, you hesitant to use the word like token on a lot of characters, I'm hesitant to use the word forced representation at times, because again, that's used a lot by people who just hate people. But I feel like that can be a huge issue with well, I'm trying to think of the word. It's not honesty, but it's kind of like in the same way, like where like you want people to feel like you actually care about them when you write people that are like them.
Oh, for sure.
But if it feels forced, it feels like you're just checking a box in your narrative to make it feel different. I don't know. Again, I'm a white guy, so like I don't really know for sure everybody's perspectives. But hearing people's stories, it feels like sometimes like I feel so pandered to that I'm done with the story, even though I like these characters.
Yeah, well, I think that's also something that's tricky that I think as white people, and this is, to be clear, this is something that I have fallen into in my writing and in my personal life. But there's a sense in which like we live like on colonized land, right? This is not, the Americas. It's like it's a colonial state, right? And I think, and that manifests with slavery and with the oppression of indigenous peoples and stuff like. It's like, but there's a real temptation, I think, to be like, oh man, like it sucks to be white, and like and like kind of and like guilt yourself about it, right? And this is something that I have done. To be clear, I am not saying that I am immune to this, but I think that's, like you can't really do anything about you being white, but you can do something to dismantle whiteness and white supremacy as a construct, right?
Yeah.
And I think like centering the work and like considering your liberation to be part of that work, right, is way more valuable and important than kind of renouncing your white privilege. Like you can't do anything about your white privilege, right? It's something that you have to leverage. And like, I don't think feeling guilt about that is bad, right? I think that's like part of the process, right? And you should and like try to work through those kinds of feelings, but you don't need to do that with everyone around you, right? And I think that like often a lot, I think corporate art especially can't get to that like next step, right? And I think there's also like there's some truth as well to the idea of like staying in your lane, right? I'm trying to remember, there's this critic who was talking about I'm trying to remember her name, because I just see her retweeted a lot. I want to say Jordan, but anyway, she's a film writer, film critic. Maybe I'll find, and she talked about like, I don't want the Coen brothers to make a movie about Black people that would be racist. They're like, it would be a racist movie. Like, give me money to make a movie about Black people, right? Like, I'm fine with the Coen brothers making whatever they want, but like, I know that they can't do this thing, right? But I can, or like my peers can, right? And I think like moving that and entrusting other people to do that work and then also uplifting them when they do that work is like really important. And I think that's like, like the fact that like this was one of the first instances where I discovered queerness. And also in Reinventing Comics, McCloud speaks really openly about like, hey, like, the vast majority of comic creators are cis white men, right? I don't think he uses the word cis, but then and he talks about like, here are all these creators who are doing interesting things with gender and sexuality, right? And like tries to give them space in this book that is his book, right? But like you're like, hey, this is stuff that's things in the field that are interesting that you should check out, right?
And the difference between like giving someone praise, because the thing about it is everybody talks about these issues or kind of portrays these issues as very black and white or very close to black and white, even though when you dump into this middle of everything, it becomes very gray in some areas, and then it can be turned into very black and white issues. But there is something to be said with, like, once again, Ben is using his power to introduce all these characters that are people of color or different queernesses, just on any spectrum of things. And even if he doesn't nail it, or it does come off as feeling very like checking boxes, there's people who come in after him that have now a space to talk about their stories. Because I think about now who's writing Miles. I don't remember his name on the top of my head, but he's using that character to tell his story. Cindy Grace used Iceman to tell his queer story. Like, people are using these characters to tell their stories, and they only got there because some white guy felt like, oh, I have this power and I can just make this thing.
Which, I think that speaks to real systemic problems, right? But it's also like, you do have to, if you are in that space, you have to try and open that door to other people. And like,
it's not really a thank you for doing this, but more like a cool, it's awesome that this is here now.
Yeah, like this is, and the thing is, like, those people should like already have their books, and maybe they shouldn't have to like write Iceman, right?
Yeah,
and maybe they should also get to make those kinds of decisions about these kinds of characters, right? So it's just a complicated thing. I don't think I have like, I mean, I always have thoughts about representation, especially someone who very rarely finds things that resonate with me that are literally trans, right? But often it's subtextual, or sort of about that ends up hitting me a certain way, right? But yeah, that's anyway. But I think generally speaking, like, and it's kind of like, this issue is kind of like an after school special, right? But it's treated, I think, with like a real, and there's a couple of lines in it that I think struck many readers at the time, McCloud says, and struck me at the time, right? And the sense of there is something real that is being articulated there, right? And that is also true to, I think, McCloud's own experiences.
And comparing this once again to Zot to Strangers in Paradise, with like books at the time that really were just trying to stay like pave a new lane for creators in a lot of ways. Strangers in Paradise is a book, at least where I left off. I have not finished the series, so I don't know where it goes. But at the time where I finished it, it's very queer adjacent and trying to find its way into that world, but trying to find it naturally. And so it keeps on bumping into it over and over again. And you feel like you feel natural, but at the same time, you knew if they just gave into it right then and there, that's when it would become unnatural. And I think that's an interesting thing for a straight writer or a white writer, anybody that's writing characters that are not them, is how do they transition to the story they want to tell, even though it's not about them, in a natural way without betraying the reader's trust in their storytelling.
I think that's interesting. I'm trying to think about like, I mean, that's one thing that like I think is interesting about Zot is there's some really interesting tensions, especially I think in stuff that you haven't gotten to yet. So 9 Jack 9 is a villain in the 10 issues, right? So he has a big arc later that's like the darkest arc of that run of like the superhero stuff, and that kind of begins to like complicate a lot of the like Paradise. Like, anyway, like the inciting incident is that 9 Jack 9 is like, so it's preface, 9 Jack 9 is a supervillain, and he can like, he's like this electrical man, and he can like move through machines and stuff, and like manipulate, electronics and whatnot. He's trying to kill the daughter of this like diplomat who he murdered, right? Because like this oppressive regime is trying to take over on another planet, and so he's been hired by like the generals of this like, fascist group to like kill this young girl who is like the last remaining family member of like this, diplomat who is fighting against them, right? And that like,
sure.
And like what, and so, and the thing is the book book never gets into those tensions, full in on that, right? It sort of explores that stuff, but in some ways, like that evocation of it is like almost more interesting. You know, this beautiful Earth, right? This paradise, but over here on this planet, things are really bad, and like how do we sort of work with that and deal with that is like a, you know, there's a question. But I think text and subtext are both great. This is my official opinion.
I agree. There's an issue early on, somewhat in the black and white stuff, that they get knocked out and Jenny wakes up and reality is shifted.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a really subtextual thing near the end of that issue, and kind of the text at the same time, about mental illness and the kind of the stigma of it all at that time too. And it's very interesting that, because I'm pretty sure Zot wasn't like 86, 87, or was it 90s?
I think it's like right at the cusp of the 90s. So I think it is like late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, that those stigmatizations are here today, like still really strong in a lot of ways. And so to have a comic really try to present the idea of gaslighting people that are having issues, and trying to push them into boxes, is very fascinating to read a comic book do in the middle of, again, a comic that's about like a retro superhero.
Yeah, well, this is like, you know, she's inside this giant robot who's trying to like kill every human on Earth or something, you know, like it's but I think that that's a really great issue, and I think speaks to like some of the, like, there is a subliminal power to a lot of the stuff that's in Zot, right? And I think that's actually, I didn't even think about that angle, even though it's right there, right? Like, you are totally right. That's like, reading that story is the thing about mental illness is completely like a very interesting read. That's, and again, like this thing that tension is still there, right? Where she's in the world that she knew, and her, you know, her parents are divorced and her brother's still a jerk, right? And her friend Terry's still her friend, but Zot's a TV show and that world never existed, right? And that, you know, that tension between, no, I know that this thing is real, right? I know that this good thing is real, but the world around me does not reflect it, right? The way that issue sort of microcosms that exact problem is really cool.
And it's up, and that one issue alone can be just sat down and examined to death for ages if you really want to, which I think speaks to the comic as a whole being so deep without presenting itself as such.
Well, I didn't even think about this until this moment, but there's a scene where she sees Zot, right? Like, I think she's going to a hospital, like a mental institution, and she sees Zot there, and it's like, oh, it's Zot, but then she like tries to touch him, and it's like paper, right, tearing away, and that image of like, but Zot is literally paper, right? He is printed paper.
Yep.
You know, like, he is a superhero that is not real, and is this like, so that sense of like reaching for the ideal that then like falls apart is like such a cool image. I'm getting jazzed about this issue. I didn't even think about this.
It comes down also to like the end of the colored issues too, where they open up the door that's been the goal the whole time.
Yeah.
And it's cement blocks at first, and they're like, "What kind of sick joke is this?" Well, it's like that is the sick joke, that this world doesn't matter. It's a block. Like, you're gonna hit a point where there's just a hard end.
Yeah.
And you're not gonna see anything else in it.
Right.
And that's the idea of comic books in general, is like, unless you're a big name book or a creator that doesn't know how to let go of his creator-owned projects and names I will not name, the world at some point will just stop, and you're going to hit a wall, and there's nothing left.
Yeah.
And I think that's, and Zot at the time was like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And for people who get connected or attached to these characters, I feel like, unless you make your own works, which is a whole nother story, there's a point where it's hard to let go once something ends.
Yeah, well, I think that's actually something. So I don't want to spoil too much, but the last issue, you know, Zot can return home, and basically like all these characters that we've been getting to know across these sort of more personal Earth stories go there, and it's kind of like this ode to the superhero comic, right, as a means of escapism, right, or sort of this like ideal, like this beautiful world that we can go to for a little while where things really are better, right? And that will like give us strength and give us like purpose so that we can come back to the real world and like do something. And I'm not sure how much I like completely jive with that, like that messaging, especially when I think superhero comics especially we talked already about like the very direct relationship between like military contractors and Marvel movies in particular.
Yeah.
But there's this very material relationship. But at the same time, I do think like there was a sense that like we look at these things, and maybe we can dream of something better for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, and I think, like that's the thing is Zot is really interesting book, I think, to this day, because it's someone who is both very critical of superhero comics and wary and weary of them, but
Mm-hmm.
also
Mm-hmm.
has this like like this very undying affection for them, and sort of this like but this is what I love and I can't let go of it, right? And it's funny in some of the later issues where it's like these very personal, grounded stories about people trying to live their lives and pay rent and like dealing with their parents, and then it's like Zod is in the background wearing spandex, but
Mm-hmm.
that's sometimes the life we live in, right? And the way, and so I think that there's a very, I think, interesting honesty to it that I think this time around.
And so to get back to your life with comics, I'm really curious. When you found Zot in kind of like in the middle of everything, like 2006, you said.
Yeah.
And so after you read it, how do you think after reading Zot, Life After Zot,
Zot,
how do you think it shifted your perspective on just how you create art or how you look at art in life in general? Like, because that's like the thing I love most about this medium is it really can change your perspective on just everything if it hits you in the right way.
I think like that's not one of the things I think about with stuff that's really changed me, but I think there's a couple things that really stuck with me. So at the end of so this character who wants to become a comic book writer, right?
Mm-hmm.
There in the essay after that issue, Scott talks about like in my headcanon, right, in my belief, like he gets to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ronnie's the character's name, I just remembered. Ronnie becomes like a great comic book writer, right, and gets to do this stuff because that was my dream too, right? And like that was, and like to me, it feels like if I don't let him do that, I'm letting myself down, right?
Yeah.
And there's not the exact wording, but it's something like that, right? And I think that which struck me as someone, and it just increasingly is becoming like very sort of frustrated and disillusioned with a lot of the. So I love writing deeply, and I'm incredibly satisfied with the work that I've done, and want to do like so much more writing and making things. But it's also like looking at sort of everything that's happening, and knowing that like a lot of these fields are like capital B bad, right? That like that they like use people or underpay people, or often there's like a class dynamic even within them. I mean, it was wild seeing like people post, staffed video game writers post their salaries and think about, wow, that's like so much more money than I make, right?
Yeah.
Or that's so much more money than like my freelancer friends make. And that isn't to like necessarily be like, oh, those people are evil, but there is like a real sort of material thing happening there, right? And so I think for me, like that has stuck with me for a long time, because I think there's that like the willingness to dream, right? To like want to, and it's something like, like for, in some capacity, I've wanted to write or create like since I was a kid, and like trying to believe that that's something that I can do, maybe not professionally, but like something that I can do and get fulfillment out of is like a daily battle, right? And I think
I get that.
Zot is like something that has like brought that up, and sort of, especially since McCloud's very reflective, right? That he's writing about the book itself is obviously very self-reflective, as we talked about, but then also he's writing all these essays about it and talking about the creative process of it, right? And like that openness, that frankness, I think has stuck with me, and especially struck me this time around.
Yeah, I mean, I've been struggling with some of the same things of like my end goal when it comes to my writings, where like I'm a huge fan of comics and have been for ages, and I want to write. That's the thing. I want to write fiction. That's how it goes. And my end goal has always been, one day I will get my hands on Batman at some point. That's just going to happen. It's just going to happen at one point. But at the same time, especially these last few weeks, you really examine how that institution, especially with just DC itself, but all around with the comics right now, how messed up everything is underneath. And even though you love these characters, you love these worlds, they're hurting the creators who are making them in a lot of ways. And it's becoming a real struggle with is that dream worth all these sacrifices that's happening right now within that industry. Like, do I want to see this industry collapse and all my characters kind of die so people can have better lives within it?
Yeah. No, I think that's a real thing, and that I think something we have to try and do, and is like it's a political struggle as well as an artistic one, is try to envision a world that does not exist yet, right? That is kinder and better, and that has justice and mercy, right? And I think sometimes we have to do that like on our own, and especially in the way we make things, right? And like take value out of that act of creation in of itself, right? I think this is like I don't know, this is like, if I did writing panels, this is like the advice I would give every time, is like, just like take value out of the work itself, and don't value the result more than the work, right? Like the work should be enough on its own.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think that's like, I don't think that's something that like McCloud taught me or something, but I think that's like something that, you know, colored my relationship, I think, with creating, and like, you know, and I think that's just like an important way of like, and I think the thing is that goes for so much stuff. That's one of the things about like capitalism, right? Is like, you are alienated from labor. You do not see the results of your labor, right? You are, all that stuff is someone else, right? And your job, I mean, not for everybody, but for a lot of folks, has less tangible use, right? Like if you were the town cobbler, like you knew what was up, right? You knew what you had to do. And that's not true for me, who does like weird SEO stuff.
Yeah,
right?
I get what you're saying with that.
Right. But like, you sort of have to claim that value for yourself, and like take it and like separate it from finances, right? And start to envision like, hey, what does the world look like if people, you know, aren't abused, or like without sort of these power hierarchies that allow sort of abuse and these kinds of things to happen. And it's tough, especially when like people who, I think, you know, there are artists who help us maybe see that world, who also are complicit in it and do bad things in it, right? And like dealing with that and trying to figure out what, you know, to do with that can be a complicated process. But I think it's also like, every step that I've taken towards like freeing myself from capitalism has been like deeply, deeply liberating, right? And it's also frustrating, right? Because you like look at the world, and this is also like the thing that Jenny goes through all the time. You're like, this sucks. I don't want to be here.
Yeah,
I don't want to be doing this, right? But when you sort of like, okay, but I have value, I have worth, and I can like put that worth on the page, and that's like, it's not, I don't know, immutable is maybe the wrong word, but that's real, right? That's really powerful, I think. And that's something that I hope that like young writers out there and like creators who are listening to this, like that's, I think, such an important thing to remember, that can be also very difficult too.
Yeah, and I think with his reading that essay, Scott saying like, I wanted him to make it, like in my head canon, he makes it. I think the idea is Scott realizes how hard being this kind of creator is.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he knows also, I think he does realize how fulfilling the work is when you're doing it, when you're working on it.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I just feel like him saying the character has to succeed, I think it's also telling him that he has succeeded in a weird way, like saying like,
yeah,
you finally did it, like you did what you wanted to do, and now you get to write a character who's you, who got to do it.
Right, who got to be there. Yeah, I think there's a moment where he talks about so he was buddies with the Mutant Ninja Turtle guys, because they were also in the independent comic scene, right? And like he tells a story in this book about like going to the store and seeing a Mutant Ninja Turtle mac and cheese, and being like, oh, this is so funny. Like I know like my wife will get a big kick out of this. Let's grab it. My wife Ivy. And then he looks at the price. It's like, oh, this is too expensive. Like I cannot buy this, you know?
Yeah.
And he's like, and you know, as he's like, and I realized I would remember this moment for the rest of my life. Right. And I think that to be clear, like I think there's real value. There's value in like taking care of yourself and like getting a job and like using the money that you get to help other people. I think we've seen that especially lately with like, you know, Black Lives Matter stuff with bail funds, right? Like if you were a person of even more means than your neighbor, like giving to your neighbor, right, is really important. But I also think like choosing to, hey, what do I value outside of this system and how it works is also important. And like, hopefully, you know, there will be someone who can help you along the way there, right, too. But yeah.
Yeah, and there's something to say about the idea of self-insert in your work and putting yourself in there. There's plenty of creators who do it, and the reasonings behind those are always different in some ways. But I think especially with the Zot case, and I think about early, there's a whole other can of worms, but I think about early like Stephen King works whenever he writes about a writer. He's mostly writing his self-doubts in a lot of those early works.
Oh,
because
for sure.
you read his story, you read about how hard at first it was for him to get published at all. Yeah. And then when it happened, it just kind of was a whirlwind. And so a lot of I think about The Shining, and I think about Salem a lot of the time when it comes to his early stuff, and about how those two main characters are writers, and neither one of them have happy endings. Because I think at the same time he was struggling with the idea of being a happy ending with failing so hard and then all of a sudden success. And I think with self-inserts, you really get to see the writer kind of deconstruct who they are.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting with Zot's case in particular, because he, in the essays again, like he talks about Zot's uncle Max as a self-insert, who's like this very freewheeling creative type, but also Decker as a self-insert, right? Who's like this obsessive, like creative person who's constantly searching for like new forms, but is also like extraordinarily self-destructive, right? And I think but it's tough, especially I think with like Stephen King self-inserts. I know, like, I have personally not read The Shining nor seen the movie, which I also is very different. A lot of people read The Shining as sort of this weird justification for King's own like bad behavior, but also it's tricky because you can't, like, reading like art one-to-one to someone is a really complicated thing. But I think that, like, whether or not how much you read any of these characters, as like McCloud self-inserts, I think there is this like very sort of self-reflective relationship that he's using these characters to talk about. Hey, what does art mean? What does making art mean? How do we relate to that? What is, and like that self-reflection, I think, is really important and rewarding, right?
Yeah. So I think I don't think we have, but I think at the moment we have exhausted Zot in a lot of ways.
No, I mean, I need to eat also, so
so I just want to ask a few questions and then we can just wrap it up right after.
Hit me.
So I'll just do the first two and then we can save the other ones for maybe another time.
No, you can just hit me up. I've still got time. Yeah.
All right, cool. So the first question is, when it comes to the story within comics, right? And since I now know you read a majority, what exactly is about a story that you love so much? What are you looking for within it to hit you with, for it to really just grab you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is like a very ephemeral, and I guess it like fits the question. But I just want something to chew on.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah,
and a lot of like I started playing Drakengard recently, which is the like first Yoko Taro game. I think it's the first game he directed. Definitely not the first game he worked on. And like both that and Nier Automata, which is the only other one of his that played, are both just like really just have a lot going on right away. Right. And I think you can appreciate like those works at different levels. Like I'm like kind of lukewarm, I think, on Automata as a whole. Like I definitely like it. But I think like I appreciate something that is like trying very vividly to work, right? And like mean something, or like not even necessarily mean something, but just trying to like evoke that I can chew over, right? That's the thing, is like with Automata, there's all sorts of like I mean, I'm thinking about like me as my background is like doing theory stuff, right? Like there's really interesting Marx stuff you could do with Nier Automata, but there's also really interesting like gender or like even like Freudian psychology stuff, right? There's like all these sort of angles that you could take with it because there's a lot to dig into, right? And I think just hitting a work where it's like, oh, there's like something is happening here, and something like there's something that I can use my critical apparatus with, right? That I can sort of unpack and work with, right? And I think that that's true of everything, right? I think most things can be analyzed this way, but it's like, but I think there's a difference between work that like you have to do the work, right? Like with when I wrote these like Gears of War essays with my friend Cole Henry, shouts to Cole, who's great. He's my co-host with Idle Talk. He that was a thing where it was like, especially with the first 3 games, I had to do the work to find the meaning in them, right?
Yeah.
That they were like that it's very easy to read those games as like bland, faster shooters because they kind of are, but also there's all this other stuff going on, right? But you kind of and it's not that it's like interesting subtext, right? It's just that like you have to sort of like give yourself over to the work, and that's satisfying. But it's very cool, I think, to encounter somebody who's like, oh, this is doing work, right? This object that I'm looking at is doing something, and I'm engaging with it, and it's really cool. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but
no, I get what you're saying. It's like when you come across a work that's pushing against you,
yes,
like right away, like you jump in, you're like, oh,
yeah,
I can't sit, like I can't read this in my 5-minute break. There's no way, like that kind of work. I think that's really good. That's really good stuff.
Well, it's like me, I mean, kind of like, so I watched this experimental German or Swiss film called Peppermint, which is great. I don't know how people can watch it, but it's really cool. And that's movie where I was watching, at my university, which was also in a very conservative town, and like I was just beaming the whole. It's like formally so weird. There's like upside down camera stuff, right? Like there's like it sort of disregards all conventional rules of like how you do framing, and like there's this weird mixture of sometimes like stop motion and live action and like all this stuff going on in it, right? But it's also like has really tricky stuff to say about gender and like political revolution and stuff. And it's just so like, oh, but like it's both like welcoming and resists you, and like that is just such a like I walked away from that experience just feeling like I was walking on air, right? It was like this glorious thing. And I even felt that way like after like Twin Peaks: The Return episode 8, which is like this famously, abrasive experimental episode, right? Where it's like, whoa, this is so like wild. I haven't seen anything like this before. What is this doing? How can I like work with this, right? This is such a euphoric feeling to me.
Yeah, no, I get that feeling 100%. That's usually what I strive to find more of.
Yeah.
Next question is there a comic character mostly, but is there a character that you have ever thought about really diving a piece on, or on the opposite side, like striving hard to find a way to be able to write the fiction of that character at some point?
So yeah, I would really, I guess like top of the head is like Spider-Man, because so actually like so Into the Spider-Verse I saw when I was closeted. And that's a movie that like has, I think, a lot of like queer undertones.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
Yeah, and so like, and like obviously there's all sorts of stuff going on, but sort of this idea that like Spider-Man's like this regular person who chooses to be someone, right? Who like sort of leaves life behind to become just like a normal person, right? But has to like do something extraordinary with themselves, I think is like really beautiful and resonant. And like I don't know if I'm not necessarily like I want to write that, right? But I think like that's a character that means a lot to me and that I think I could do something with, right?
Yeah. I mean there's something that goes for, I think Stan Lee was talking about this way back in the day, that the idea of Spider-Man is he's a nerd who wakes up one day to have all these powers, but he's still a nerd. Like he still has to deal with being a nerd. And
right.
That is very reductive in a lot of ways, especially nowadays. But the idea of a character that finally gets all these amazing things, feels these amazing ways, but at the same time has to deal with the reality that is.
Well, and also that I think even just the simple gut punch of the Spider-Man origin story, that he's like, well, I'm going to use this, I'm going to make money, right? Like I'm going to get mine, and then immediately hitting the wall of, oh, doing that means I'm going to hurt other people, right? Is just a really like, effective thing, and just trying to be like, okay, well, I have to. And I think especially someone who, I mean, a lot less recently, thank God that I've started transitioning, but it's dealt with self-loathing a lot. I think a story about a person who feels like they are fundamentally ill-suited to this, but has to keep doing it because they feel it's right, is I think just like really, really interesting stuff,
Yeah, I agree. The next question I had is, and this kind of goes interesting with that, especially when it goes to the black and whites, but people always tend to disregard the artist as a storyteller, but the artist really is a co-storyteller in whatever comic is being made. For sure. And there's a real argument between how much of a story is words versus how much is the art, and what are you paying for, right? So how do you personally feel when the art takes over versus heavily text story? Like for example, I think about there is an issue of Tom King's Batman, where there's no dialogue, there's no word bubbles, there's no nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And people are like, I read this book in like 30 seconds. Why did I pay $5 for it? Or whatever. It's like,
right, yeah.
There's a whole narrative there you're just skipping over because you're not paying attention.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, especially like through, because I've written a little bit about film and about cinematography, right? I think, I think it's hard to make those kinds of comparisons, right? And I think I've always identified more with the writing side of it because I think that's always been the side I've been better at, or although I have done art stuff too. But I think there's like all sorts of ways to sort of do, and I think I've been thinking a lot. I've been thinking a lot more about this in relation to video games, but I think something beautiful, or and I mean beautiful in a very broad sense, right? Like not just necessarily like, oh, the Venus de Milo, that's beautiful, but sort of like I think like, for example, the gaping dragon in Dark Souls is beautiful, right? And it's like hideous and strange, right? But it's like also this very sort of like evocative design that has, and I think stuff like that has like intrinsic value. This is something we were talking about earlier, right? That making something beautiful is like a valuable thing in of itself. And I think that like there's an association, I think, of literary with meaning, right? Especially in the game space, where it's like, oh, a game has to have themes, and a game has to have like, like well-written characters, and like sort of like it has to be like a novel or like a movie, right? In a traditional way we think about novels or movies. But like, I don't know, like Virginia Woolf is a novelist, and she was writing all this weird, like, stream of consciousness stuff, right? Like Dan Breckenhag, I'm not pronouncing that right, but is a filmmaker. He's making stuff where he's like painting film strip, right?
Yeah.
And like that stuff is really, so I think that like I think I want to value aesthetic more as like a means of creating things. So I'm not saying it's like more valuable than the real stuff, but I do think that stuff tends to be can be overvalued, right? And that art has so much of a relationship with, like, I think about Runaways, for example. Adrian Alfina is so good at doing these like teen kids and like how they dress and how they look like hanging out, right?
Yeah.
And like Brian K. Vaughan script is good, right? That's part of what makes those comics good, but it is different when there's a different artist on that, right?
No, yeah, I 100% get what you're saying with that.
Yeah.
And in the vein of trying to make something ugly beautiful, it's like me always defending Batman vs Superman, right? Like, it's an ugly movie. I know it's ugly, but to me, it's beautiful in ways.
Oh, no, I get that. I mean, I did not like that movie when I first saw it, but I think about it more than just about any other superhero movie I've watched. So,
and I think that says either something good or something bad about that movie. So,
well, but I think there's also something to, like, again, like we were talking about. I mean, I was talking about earlier, like somebody doing the work, right? And like, hey, say what you will about Batman vs Superman, it is about stuff.
Yeah,
right? That movie has stuff going on, right?
There's some messaging in there that you either agree that's in there or you don't. And
yeah,
that's how it goes. And last question is, really just recommendations. Like, do you have creators that you think people should read and know about right now that you don't think are getting the spotlight?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm sort of out of like comics in a way that like I cannot like speak to, like, hey, what are what are the little folks doing out there?
Yeah.
I guess like this is not a little guy, but like the Nausicaa manga that Hayao Miyazaki, pardon me, wrote and drew is really good and like underrated. And if you like that movie, people should check that out. Like, it's cool. Yeah, well, I'm trying to think of what else. I don't know. I like Naruto. That's unrelated. It's not like a small thing, but that's pretty dope. I hear really good things about Chainsaw Man.
As someone who's read all of Chainsaw Man, it's a book. It's something that's hard to recommend. But
hey, I mean, that sounds interesting to me.
Yeah, but if you're willing to put in the work, as we say, like, I think that is something that can be very gratifying.
Yeah. I guess like on the game side, if I can briefly diverge into that, I just played Marginalia. I think Cody Sherlock is the developer on that game. I know also a couple other folks worked on it, including Cameron Kunzelman. And that's a very, very cool horror game. It's like an hour long. It's like $3 on itch right now.
Oh, okay.
I would highly recommend folks check that out. It's really, really cool. And I also really love the work of Marina and Melos. I'm trying to remember the name of their studio, but they made Anodyne, Anodyne 2, and even The Ocean. And I think all that stuff is like really just like transcendent video game stuff that Anodyne really got its day in the sun, but I don't think 2 or even The Ocean really did, and that's a shame because they are like masterpiece video games in my opinion. So there's that. So those are my video game shout outs.
and you know, that's perfect because I mean, again, the idea of indie video games is slowly becoming more and more of a realization with me with how whiny some of the bigger creators are right now.
Yeah.
So I always want more recommendations and people who listen to this.
Yeah, well, Anodyne's in that in the Justice bundle, the first one.
Oh yeah, I picked that up, so I should try to download that and play it.
Yeah, it's good.
Well, Grace, thank you for being on. The plug away everything that you have. Tell everybody.
So yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Grace_Machine. I do a couple podcasts on the Abnormal Mapping Network. One's called Idle Talk. It's with my friend Cole, and we just kind of bullshit about whatever I've been reading or watching or playing at the time. The other one's Seasons of Your Movies, which is with my wonderful partner Emma, where we talk about